I'm J.R. Jamison, and for a moment, I want you to close your eyes and be transported back to the late 1970s. Okay, some of you, including me, weren't alive yet, but let's let our imaginations wander. It was a time in the United States that included glitter and disco, and when LGBTQ rights were beginning to gain traction. And it was also the rise of the religious right that spilled over into many areas of everyday life and organizations. And the Boy Scouts of America wasn't immune to this culture shift and clash. 1978 was a jumping off point when the Boy Scouts of America banned gay scouts and volunteers that ultimately led to a decades-long battle for inclusivity. Today on The Facing Project, my guest is journalist Mike De Socio, author of Morally Straight: How the Fight for LGBTQ Inclusion Changed the Boy Scouts and America. It's a book that tells the story that plays out over the course of 25 years, beginning with a court battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court, to the Boy Scouts eventually changing their policies to include LGBTQ scouts and volunteers. Stay with us. You're listening to The Facing Project with J.R. Jamison, and my guest today is journalist Mike De Socio, an Eagle Scout and adult volunteer with the Boy Scouts of America, whose new book dives deep into the history of the organization, exploring its tangled history with inclusion beginning in the 1970s all the way through today. Most namely with the exclusion and then acceptance of LGBTQ scouts and volunteers. Beginning with James Dale, a poster child for scouting kicked out of the organization when he was outed by a local newspaper, who took his fight all the way to the Supreme Court, and the landmark policy changes in the mid-2010s that opened up scouting for all. Mike De Socio, author of Morally Straight: How the Fight for LGBTQ Inclusion Changed the Boy Scouts and America. Thank you for joining me on The Facing Project.
Thanks so much for having me.
I really enjoyed getting the opportunity to early read your book. Talk to me more about why this was an important story for you to tell at this moment in time.
Yeah, I think the story of LGBTQ inclusion in the Boy Scouts is really one of the most important but overlooked aspects of LGBTQ history in general. So this history really had never been told in this way in a book. I think a lot of the events I write about, were covered well in local and national media at the time, but no one had really ever stepped back and stitched it all together. There were several kind of eras in this history going back to the late 70s all the way until today. And I wanted to be the person to look at all of it and understand how it all fit together. And as I started doing that, I actually realized that now was an especially important time to be learning from this history because there are so many parallels between what I wrote about happening all the way back to the 70s and what we're seeing today. So, as LGBTQ rights continue to be under attack legislatively and otherwise, I think the history that I was able to put together holds so many lessons for us. And if nothing else, can be a source of inspiration and hope, because while the battle lasted 40 years in the Boy Scouts and there were certainly losses along the way, it was ultimately a successful battle, and LGBT inclusion was secured in the Boy Scouts of America.
Mm-hmm. And it's a complicated history, a complicated story. I loved how you covered that span of time, because honestly, as somebody who also identifies as queer or as a gay man, I have to say it really wasn't until the late 1990s with James Dale when this came on my radar. And so I loved how you kind of covered this full history of the Boy Scouts of America. Also, in the opening of your book, I was struck by your conversation with John Halsey, a well-decorated active member of the Scouts for more than 60 years, who said that the organization's ban on gay boys and men in 1978 was a result of many leadership failures, including covering up the number of pedophiles involved as leaders. And in his eyes, it was an easy out to put the blame on the LGBTQ community. Even though these individuals were not the ones abusing children, it was actually often married straight men with families, as you talk about in your book. Take me back to the late 1970s. what was going on in the Boy Scouts of America?
There was a lot going on in the Boy Scouts during this period. It's one of the most interesting and I think pivotal decades for the organization. So the BSA was founded in 1910. So by the late 70s, they're a pretty old organization, but they had started to kind of fade in their cultural relevance. The big boom in membership came after World War II. The 50s and 60s were kind of this golden age of scouting. Seemingly every boy is joining the program, right? But then by the 70s, that membership starts to drop off and leaders start to get worried about how they're going to keep the organization interesting to kind of the next generation. And so they try a number of unsuccessful solutions to this problem, one of which is kind of rewriting the handbook to focus less on the traditional outdoor skills and more on skills you need to live in an urban environment. There was this kind of notorious section on treating rat bites, which was seen as like the ultimate betrayal of scouting's core values. So this was a really unpopular change that didn't last very long. One of the other things that they tried to do in the 70s was really broaden membership. There was kind of an effort to include girls in kind of a sideline program, but even the membership drive collapsed under some scandals. Actually, there were several councils that were inflating their membership numbers. So, by the end of the 70s, the Boy Scouts has tried unsuccessfully to kind of reshape the organization in a number of ways. During this period, the issue of sexual abuse also becomes a more prominent issue for Boy Scout leaders. Really, this was an issue from the founding of the organization, and leaders knew about it from basically the founding of the organization. But they tended to keep it private. They had this list, essentially a blacklist, where if an abuser was found out, they would try to keep them from rejoining the organization. But it was never something they acknowledged publicly. And in the 70s, there started to be more public awareness of this. There were more news stories about abuse. There were several lawsuits that started to become a financial liability for the Scouts. And so it kind of forced them to do something about it, or at least create the appearance that they were doing something about it. So what I say in the book is that we really can't be sure whether the anti-gay ban in 1978 was directly a way of scapegoating gay people for abuse. Although I think if we look at the timing of these issues, it certainly seems possible, right? Like this was a time when most people did conflate gay people and abusers. And so it was kind of a convenient thing to do. And it really wasn't for another several decades after that until the Boy Scouts did take concrete steps to actually prevent abuse in the organization.
It's interesting to think about that moment in just American history as well. And that was kind of also the rise of the religious right in many ways, coming to prominence, especially within politics in the country. So it does make me wonder a bit, too, how that's woven into this easy out. Although you're saying, there's really not a lot of proof that they use that as a direct easy out. But if you start to weave some of that together, it's kind of like, well, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. The 70s were a really interesting period for LGBTQ rights in general, because kind of post Stonewall in 1969, there had been all this progress, and half the country decriminalized homosexuality in the 70s. Like, they were really doing a lot of great things. And then, yes, this religious right kind of backlash was fully enforced by the end of the 70s. And so the Boy Scouts, after their failed effort to become this like urban, organization that was kind of leaving tradition behind, basically did a 180 and said, never mind, we're going to double down on tradition. We're going to throw our lot in with the religious right and create this ban on gay people.
Yeah. I appreciate how you painted a vivid and deep picture of that entangled history of gay rights and the Boy Scouts starting in 1978, as we were just talking about, all the way to today. You really set the stage by jumping off into the first legal challenge to the Scouts by James Dale, the Eagle Scout who in 1990, at the age of 19, sued the Boy Scouts of America for expelling him as an assistant scoutmaster when he was outed in a local newspaper. That case, of course, made it all the way to the Supreme Court in the year 2000, when a decision was made that the Scouts had a right to exclude adult volunteers under the pretense that individuals involved with the organization must be clean and morally straight. As you write about in your book, the Scouts were busy at that time, like we just talked about, covering up sexual abuse claims that did not involve anyone in the LGBTQ community. But the defining of clean and morally straight were weaponized to discriminate against boys and volunteers. Talk more about these two terms and their complicated history of exclusion.
Yeah, those two terms have a really complicated history. They've both been around since the founding of the organization. So I'll take each term separately here. So let's start with morally straight. This comes from the Scout Oath of the Boy Scouts, which, among other things, asks Scouts to be physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. That's actually the last phrase of the Scout Oath. And this is something that Scouts recite at every meeting. They know it from their first day in Scouts, but it was defined in a really simple way historically. It just meant basically to be a good person, to be honest in your dealings with others, actually to defend the rights of other people. That's how it's defined in the handbook that I had as a kid. And that's how Scouts understood it. No one understood morally straight to mean literally straight as in heterosexual. The historical meaning never included that. That implication, right? And then clean is actually a point in the Scout Law. So the Scout Law is a kind of string of adjectives that Scouts are asked to be, one of which is clean. And again, I think this always just had a very literal meaning, to be clean, like physically clean, to kind of keep yourself up as a person. But no one ever really taught kids like to be clean, you have to be straight. That was not part of the original meaning. Unfortunately, the BSA kind of weaponized this term, both of these terms, as you say. And it did this during the court cases over the gay ban. So you mentioned James Dale, who was the most prominent legal challenger. There was also someone named Tim Curran, who challenged the Boy Scouts in California a decade earlier. And when the Boy Scouts got to court, they had to prove that their gay ban was rooted in some fundamental part of the organization, because that would give it this constitutional freedom of association right to choose its own membership, if they could prove that it was really central. But of course they couldn't, because the ban was only created in 1978. And so they looked back to these terms, morally straight and clean, as a way of saying, look, those terms have been around since our founding. And obviously you can't be gay and be morally straight at the same time. And that argument had varying degrees of success in different courts, and they actually eventually dropped it by the time they got to the Supreme Court. That was no longer their kind of main argument. But it's really just a perversion of what those terms mean. Scouts never understood the terms in the way that the Boy Scouts tried to weaponize them.
But those two terms stuck around way beyond that Supreme Court ruling, right? To make people feel a bit insuperior in some ways, or as if they don't belong. I'm curious to know, as someone who identifies as queer, what do those two terms mean to you now? What does the Scout Law mean to you, based on your interpretation of what that law, Scout Law, means?
Yeah, as a queer person, I really do think I identify with like the true original meaning of those phrases. I think they don't necessarily mean anything different to me as they would to any other Scout. Like, I always understood from a young age morally straight to mean like being honest, defending the rights of others. And if anything, being a part of this organization as a queer person has really forced me to embody those values in a more prominent way, especially as I started to speak up about inclusion and write about queer inclusion in really prominent ways. I found myself having to really anchor myself in the idea of being morally straight and these values that I learned from the Boy Scouts, ironically, that kind of showed me the way and how to advocate for what I saw as the future that the organization really needed to embody. I'm curious about, you write some in your book that some churches host or oversee chapters of local Boy Scouts, right? But that's not a requirement, but it often does fall within churches. Did that terminology get mixed up in that as well? And when we kind of look at the separation of those not hosted by churches and those that are different in values? There certainly were nuances to how each troop would interpret the Scout Oath and Law and all of the material, really. And as you say, a lot of troops, for a while, the majority of troops were sponsored by churches. My troop growing up wasn't actually. I grew up in a troop that was sponsored by an elementary school parent teacher association. So it was very secular. And there was not really any religious valence to what I was learning. But certainly in some of the more religious troops, there was more of a mesh between the church sponsor and the troop leadership. Sometimes they were one and the same. And I'm sure there were churches who weaponized those terms in the same way that the BSA would end up doing. But I don't know. I really do think most kids, we have to remember that Cub Scouts start when they're 5 or 6 years old, and then if you continue on to Boy Scouts, you're a young teenager. We're understanding these terms in a simpler way, and we're not thinking too much about, oh, does morally straight mean heterosexual and all that. I don't think that was really explicit in many contexts in scouting.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to 2011. It's the year you earned your Eagle Scout, and the fight for gay inclusion was reemerging in a significant way when this time another 19-year-old Eagle Scout, Zach Walls, stepped into the national spotlight. Zach had addressed the Iowa House of Representatives to support his two moms and oppose a proposed gay marriage ban in the state. And subsequently, he wrote a memoir, My Two Moms, Lessons of Love, Strength, and What Makes a Family, using the Scout law as the structure for his chapters. Zach's intelligence, charisma, and sharp arguments helped propel this energy among those who wanted to reopen this conversation of inclusion in the Scouts, while at the same time bringing others into the fold who had been discriminated against, including, as you write about in your book, Jennifer Tyrell, who was expelled as the den mother of her son's Cub Scout pack because she was gay. Ultimately, these intersecting stories led to a 4-year battle with many ups and downs that concluded with the Boy Scouts of America accepting openly gay scouts in 2013 and gay volunteers 2 years later. But it wasn't a clean and easy fight. You profiled Zach and Jennifer and many others who fought so hard for these rights despite their many setbacks that they had faced along the way. What did you learn from them?
It was really an honor for me to learn from people like Zach and Jennifer. It was so cool that they relived their stories one more time, at least for me, and shared so much of that. And I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from Zach and Jennifer and the others that I include in my book. One of the biggest from these two in particular, I think, is about the power of storytelling. So both Zach and Jennifer rose to prominence essentially entirely on the strength of their own stories. So to give a little more detail, Zach was raised by lesbian moms and came to prominence actually not because of his work in scouting, but because he gave this viral YouTube video speech that kind of talked about that background. He was testifying in front of the Iowa legislature, and just this really powerful narrative about him growing up with gay moms, but still becoming this kind of like ideal of American boyhood or manhood as an Eagle Scout really was powerful for people. And he became this media darling after that, essentially. And that's what led him to eventually found and lead Scouts for Equality, which was the organization that led this campaign. And then if you think about Jennifer, she was just a lesbian mother minding her own business who actually didn't even want to join scouting, who kind of was reluctantly dragged in by her son and became a really beloved den mother. And then when she was kicked out, her community immediately rallied around her and said, this isn't right. We love Jennifer as a leader and she hasn't done anything wrong. And when she started a change.org petition, her story too, like really lit up this debate, I think, after almost a decade of dormancy. And so those stories are, I think, largely credited to restarting the campaign for inclusion. And it took what was a kind of abstract policy debate and made it really concrete. It kind of woke people up to see that this discriminatory policy still existed, that it was harming people, and it drove hundreds of thousands of Americans to sign petitions in support of inclusion. So that feels like the biggest lesson for me, is that these personal stories, when shared and leveraged, are what gave the campaign power and fueled it throughout the entire 4 years until their victories in 2015.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about Zach and Jennifer, or even going all the way back to James, they were not seeking the limelight. They
No.
were standing up really on their own right moral courage to say this isn't right. And I have a story here to tell. I watched a TED talk that you did recently talking about the power of stories and how Zach, in many ways, and even Jennifer, right, they helped inspire you to lean into your own story. Were they a bit of the propeller for you to write this book?
Maybe a bit unconsciously, but yes, you're right to say that in that TED talk, I really focus on my storytelling efforts within scouting. And this kind of originated back in 2017 when a friend of mine actually inspired me to share my story. His name was Ryan, and he came out to me at a scouting conference, which then spurred me to come out to him. And it was this journey that kind of allowed me to be more open about myself in scouting. And we told those stories publicly in HuffPost a couple years later. And that was really when it dawned on me that these stories had a lot of power to start conversations and to kind of push the culture forward. And ever since then, I've been thinking about how to use storytelling in different ways. So I think that was the more direct inspiration for the book, was thinking about, okay, I've told my own story in a really powerful way. I think these other stories that have been kind of lost to history need to be told again.
Mm-hmm. You write in the book, you weave in your own story as well, which I found to be really powerful. And as you mentioned, you came out later. How did this battle for inclusion in the Scouts between 2011 and 2015 and some of these personal stories like we just talked about, how did they help you accept your own identity?
I think that time period really cut both ways. It didn't, in some respects, help me accept my identity. I also think it hindered me a lot because I had a lot of doubts about my sexuality and I didn't acknowledge them for a very long time. And when I did begin to acknowledge them, right in the middle of that 2011 to 2015 period, it felt really almost impossible to confront them or to accept them in the face of this BSA debate. Because while there were people like Zach and Jennifer and Scouts for Equality out there saying, you know, gay people deserve to be included, the official Boy Scouts organization was still doubling down and saying, no, gay people are immoral, essentially. And that really weighed on me. And I felt like, as, you know, a teenager and then as a college student, like, how could I possibly come out, or not even come out, even just like acknowledge myself as a gay person if it betrays this huge part of my life, which was scouting. So even by the time the policies were defeated in 2015, I still had a lot of those fears and doubts, because I thought, even though the policy had changed, the culture really hadn't. And I think I go back to that experience with my friend Ryan as what really started to shift things for me, because when he came out to me at a scouting conference, right, in this context, it was like, oh, maybe I can do that too. And I did in that moment, just to him, I came out. But I started to do it more and more after that and started to lose some of the fear. So, as I say, I think this time period delayed my coming out in some ways, but then it was also my scouting community that ultimately inspired me to take that leap.
Do you still find yourself in moments where you are scared about being so openly out and involved in the Scouts, knowing the history of the organization? I'm recounting, and I don't want to give away too much of your book because, of course, we want folks to read it. But there's a moment where you're in a van with an older gentleman who asks you about, I believe you were headed to the Jamboree, correct me if I'm wrong. And he asked where you were headed and you talked about it. And he kind of winced at this idea of the Scouts being so open now to everyone. And in that moment, I could tell you really didn't want to get into a debate or argument with him. Do those moments like that, and even just internally, do you ever still find some fear? And what gives you the courage to keep pushing forward?
Yeah, I did still feel some of that fear. You're referencing a conference I attended in 2022 where I was volunteering in the LGBTQ inclusion space. And yeah, there were a lot of moments, such as the one in the van and others, where I felt like even as this person who had written very publicly about being queer in scouting and kind of made this my thing, yeah, I still wasn't always sure how it would be received by certain people, especially older men in the organization. I don't find myself in a ton of scouting contexts lately. The past couple of years, I've kind of stepped back from volunteering and focused more on my writing. But yeah, I have that hesitation still, and even in my everyday life. It's one thing to be on the internet as a queer person. It's another thing to be kind of in physical space with someone and wonder, is this going to be safe for me or even just uncomfortable? And do I want to deal with that right now? Do I have the energy for that right now?
Mm-hmm.
So I do still make those calculations all the time. It's not this universal always being loud and proud everywhere.
Mm-hmm. How has writing the book and having it out into the world, right? Like writing a book and putting it out into the world is kind of coming out in a different way.
Sure.
What has been the response? And could you talk a bit about something that has surprised you around the book coming out? Both maybe positive and, as we were talking about, sometimes people on the internet aren't the friendliest when it comes to folks who are in the LGBTQ community. Could you talk a bit about that? Yeah,
totally. Yeah, this book was a bit like ripping the Band-Aid off, even though I had talked about certain things previously. I get pretty vulnerable about my own experiences, and like my parents read this book and lots of family, and there's some moments that I kind of cringe thinking about them reading. But I think it was important for me to do that. And I've been surprised that the response has been really positive. I think some folks have just not acknowledged the more awkward parts of it because they don't want it to be weird, and that's fine by me. But I've heard from so many people who said, like, thank you for including your own story and thank you for being so vulnerable, because I felt seen and I had that experience too. And I thought I was the only one, and now I know I'm not. And it's just been really cool to hear. I've been screenshotting all these DMs and texts and things because that's like why I wrote this book. I wanted people to feel seen in that way. So it's been really cool to have that. And I've actually been surprised by how little negative reaction there's been. I expected there to be trolls in my Goodreads and Amazon reviews and all that kind of stuff. But there really hasn't been any of that. I've heard from some disgruntled older scouters basically by email who I've, not really engaged with a whole lot, but it's not been like this big culture battle online that I thought it would be. And maybe that's because it hasn't reached enough people yet, or maybe it's just because we've kind of moved past that as an organization. I'm not sure. But it's been a pleasant surprise either way.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard from the Boy Scouts, the national office?
I haven't. So I really didn't hear from them much, even during the reporting of the book. I tried to engage with them in various ways, and they either declined or ignored most of my requests. And then after publication, they haven't acknowledged the book at all. I haven't heard from them. So I'm really not sure what they make of it.
Yeah. Did you send them a signed copy?
I did not. I think that'd be a little passive aggressive. No, I did not send them a copy.
What did writing this book teach you about the fight for LGBTQ rights?
Yeah, when I look at this history, I really learned that so many of these battles are cyclical, and that there are just so many echoes from the past in what we are seeing today. So to talk about the 70s again, I honestly feel like we're just living through like another 70s right now because it looks so similar. Back then, as we mentioned earlier, the gay rights movement had come off this like really good decade of progress and then faced a really big backlash. And even the language that the kind of opponents in the 70s were using is so similar to what we're hearing today. This groomer language, kind of implying that LGBTQ people are pedophiles, the idea of like protecting our children, all of that was being said in the 70s too by Anita Bryant and others. And today we find ourselves in this really similar period. We had a really successful decade, I would say, in the 2010s, gay marriage, among other things, happening in that decade. And then the 2020s have been this backlash again, this kind of legal fight again, and this same language being used. So as depressing as it is in some ways that these periods of backlash keep happening, I also find a little bit of solace in that because I know that these things are cyclical, and I truly don't think what we're seeing right now is going to last very much longer. I think it's already losing steam. We're seeing this year those kind of avalanche of bills in state houses mostly fail. And so I think our history in general can give us a lot of hope. But I think specifically this part of the history shows we can win over the long term and that the backlash doesn't last forever.
I was going to say, please tell me we're not heading into the 1980s. I'm not ready for a decade of that. I'm hoping what we've lived through recently has been kind of the late 70s and all of the 80s and early 90s rolled into.
Yeah, I hope so too. I hope so too. I don't think it'll last quite that long.
What did you learn about yourself while writing this book?
Yeah. It goes back to part of what I said earlier of kind of confronting a lot of my personal stories that I included in the book. It really forced me to revisit difficult memories, difficult parts of my childhood, of my time in scouting. And I realized that scouting has been both a really big gift and a really big burden in my life. And it's hard to separate those two things. It's a gift in some really obvious ways because it gave this incredible structure to my youth. It helped me learn a lot of essential life skills that I still use. And it gave me this community that I hold dear. Like the people that I met, especially in my later teens in scouting, I consider kind of a chosen family. I have a lot of really, really beautiful and close friendships that I met through scouting. So I wouldn't want to give any of that up, of course. But it was also a big burden because these policies really severely impacted my ability to see myself and accept myself as a queer person. Had I not been in scouting, I probably would have come out a lot earlier. I went to this very artsy, kind of liberal high school that it would have been totally okay for me to come out in. And I just didn't acknowledge that part of myself at all in high school. And that feels like kind of a lost time in my life. So there's still a lot of complicated feelings that come with that. I wouldn't want to give it up, but I think I learned during this process that it was a lot more complicated of an experience than I gave it credit for.
Your brother also identifies as a part of the LGBTQ community, and you write about this in your book. Was he a scout?
Very briefly. So my older brother joined Cub Scouts. I think for about a year. My mom tried to get him into it, and he immediately said, "No, thanks. This is not for me." And that was the end of his scouting journey.
Yeah. Did he have a tougher time with his coming out process as well? Or is there definitely a correlation with the scouts maybe impacting your journey in a different way than his?
Our journeys were a little different. So my brother also went to kind of a different kind of high school. It was a magnet school. And he actually came out his freshman year of high school when I was still in middle school. And so that kind of rocked my world at the time. Someone, I thought I was straight, and our whole family kind of struggled with it. And even though he felt empowered in certain contexts, at least in school, to be out, it was not very easy for him at home, I think, for most of high school. And it was something that went really like unacknowledged in our household and that we just didn't talk about. And so I'm grateful for him because I think he blazed a path in a lot of ways. And by the time I came out, when I was in college, so much, much later, my parents had come a long way and culture had come a long way. And it was very easy in my family context to come out. But he had to deal with a lot more than I did, I think, because I kind of waited until it was safe and he just ripped the Band-Aid off really early.
Yeah. Did writing this book reconfirm your commitment to the Scouts?
I think writing this book showed me why scouting still matters. So many people going back to the 70s, certainly, and even today, just find so much solace in this program. And there's still an irony there. There was certainly during the time of anti-gay policies, but even now, scouting is still seen as this really traditional organization. And yet I hear from LGBTQ scouts and scouters constantly that this is the place in their community where they feel most at home. This is where they feel the safest, even if it's not perfect. And I think that remains a really important space in this country. One in four high school kids now identify as LGBTQ. This is not a small community. And a lot of them live in places where their school or their home or their sports team might not be accepting. And at the very least, scouting offers an environment where, you know, every troop is technically required to accept them. Again, there's varying levels of cultural acceptance, but it just offers a lot of possibility, I think, for youth to find spaces that they need. So I think scouting still really matters for that reason.
Mm-hmm. You've also started the Morally Straight podcast, where you share the stories of others who are still fighting for a more inclusive future for the Boy Scouts of America. What have you learned from these stories?
The podcast has been a really cool opportunity for me. I got to highlight some of the stories from the book, share some others, or expand on others. And I think the really big theme of those interviews has been, you don't need to be like special to make a difference or to contribute to something like this, because every one of the people I've interviewed on the podcast, as you mentioned earlier, were just like normal people. Some of them were like actively resisting the media spotlight, but they were all confronted with something that they just could not like stand by and watch. When you're part of an organization that teaches you this really strong sense of morality and right and wrong, you're the precise kind of person who would stand up against a policy of discrimination once you learned about it. And, you know, Jennifer Terrell, Zach Walls, all these folks who we've talked about were just normal people who were like, wait a second, I can't sit back and let this happen. I need to contribute in some way. So I think those interviews have really taught me that like anyone can make a change and contribute to progress, as cliche as that sounds, and that you don't need to be trained. You don't need to be, you know, an organizer to do that kind of work. You just need to stand up for what you believe in.
Mm-hmm. Have you stayed in touch with Zach and Jennifer and others after the book has come out? And what was their response?
Yeah, I've stayed in touch with folks to varying degrees. You know, I sent everyone an email after it came out just to let them know in case they had missed it. Some people have been really excited about it. I actually got to do a couple of book events with people who were in the book, which was cool. Others have been, I don't know, just like busier and haven't had the time to really like read it yet or get excited about it, which is fine too. People lead very busy lives. But I've had some really cool responses from folks who just said like, you really nailed it. Like you got my story in a way that no other journalist has before. And that means the world to me, because that was part of this project, was to say, yes, you've been in the media spotlight, you've been covered, but now we've got the luxury of time and space. And I really want to do this the right way. Maybe for the last time, hopefully not. But if it is, I want this to be memorialized correctly. So when I got those kinds of responses, it really meant the world to me.
Mm-hmm. It's been a decade now since the Boy Scouts of America voted to include gay youth and adult volunteers, and half a decade since trans youth and cisgender girls have been allowed to join. Where do you see the organization moving in the next decade regarding inclusivity?
Thankfully, there are no more policy battles in that realm to be fought. You know, the doors are open to everyone, regardless of gender and sexual orientation, which is great. So I think the work of the next decade is really to continue this kind of culture change, which is a lot harder. It's very easy to, you know, issue a policy memo or whatever, but moving an organization of 2 million people in a different cultural direction is a lot harder. So I think the work is about making sure every single scout troop and every single scout leader is welcoming to queer and trans kids and excited to have them. I think that means investing more in training. There's been a little bit of that, but I think adult leaders are really hungry actually to know how they can do this. Like I hear not so much that people don't want to do inclusion work, it's just that they don't know how, or their heart's in the right place, but they're not sure. They're afraid of making mistakes. And so I really would love to see the national organization invest in that kind of training and providing resources. Like there's a lot of questions that come up and not always a lot of clear answers about how to include kids. So I think that's really the work of the next decade.
Mm-hmm. Is there a chance, because troops in many ways are independent, even though they're under this umbrella of the Boy Scouts of America, and depending on where that troop may be geographically, culturally, there might be a chance that not all of the troops are embracing these new values of the Boy Scouts of America. Are there controls in place for reporting, or how do we make sure that it's really an inclusive environment? I mean, sure, like some of the trainings that you're talking about maybe need to come down from the national office to say this is important, right? Like that's an important voice to that needs to speak in that area. But are there reporting mechanisms or safe spaces, as you will, for some of these kids or adult volunteers to say, hey, this is not happening in my area?
Yeah, I think there are some, probably not enough. I mean, there's a mechanism where each troop reports to a council, which is kind of organized at like the county level usually. And in theory, a troop or even a scout should be able to go to the council leadership and say, hey, this troop is not abiding by the policies or is not creating a welcoming environment. And that works sometimes, but of course that also assumes that the council leadership is welcoming and inclusive, which again is not always the case. So that's also been kind of a struggle, I think, of the last 10 years of saying, yes, the national organization has an important voice and needs to do those things, but troops and councils do operate with a good bit of autonomy. I think we've seen over time the folks that are not as inclusive or excited about this kind of leave or kind of go away quietly. So from what I see, it's going kind of more in the direction of inclusive troops, and there are less and less of the ones that aren't. But yeah, there's not always a clear enforcement mechanism.
I keep going back to this moment in time we're living in that, as you talked about earlier, it's kind of like we're reliving the 70s and late 70s in some ways, and we're hopeful for the future, right? But it's hard for me as I think about a hard future to not think about the resurfacing of right-wing individuals and elected officials who are vilifying the LGBTQ plus community by associating with them, like we've talked about before, with pedophiles and using slurs like groomer toward the community. And as you wrote about, and we've talked a little bit about, the sort of ambiguity that comes from the national leaders of the Boy Scouts of America when they have an opportunity to talk about the inclusion of LGBTQ members. Do you think the organization will continue to take the high road in supporting scouting for all, or how could the Scouts be a leader at this moment in time?
I do think that scouting will maintain their inclusionary policies at the very least. I find it really hard to imagine a future where those policies get rolled back and the doors start to close again. I think that's partly just because of how long it took to get here and how hard the fight was. I mean, the Boy Scouts literally spent 40 years arguing over these issues. And I would be shocked, quite frankly, if they decided to backpedal and kind of reopen that can of worms. I think they're absolutely done with that conversation. But that being said, they are sometimes too shy, I think, about those policies, which I think is their strategy to make it through this moment without too much controversy. I think they need to be louder. I think they should be louder in their inclusion of LGBTQ people, but I think they're scared that if they do that, they'll invite more criticism or more right-wing backlash, which they don't want to do. So it's this delicate dance for them. And again, I don't think they're going to be rolling back policies, but I do think there's an opportunity for them to not just quietly allow queer and trans kids to join, but really proudly say, we want you here, and to be as loud as the right-wing politicians that are denigrating the LGBTQ community. I think that's a really important message for youth to receive from the national organization. And right now, it's not always something that they get.
And as we've talked about before, stories are the most powerful tool for change. And that is what helped propel change within the Boy Scouts of America. But often those who are oppressed are the ones who are having to speak their truth and their stories in order to make that change. You write, and you've talked about the LGBTQ community having an important place in storytelling and journalism, but that we must protect our mental health. What does that look like? And what do you wish allies or non-LGBTQ folks understood about this added pressure of us always having to share our stories to be the one to make change?
Storytelling really was the storytelling from LGBTQ individuals in particular really was what drove this campaign for inclusion over the decades. But yeah, it took a big toll on mental health for some folks. I remember Jennifer Trail telling me that every time she had to talk to the media, she felt like she was essentially reliving her trauma, which was really hard for her. And even when she talked to me, I'm sure she felt that way. So I think being able to protect mental health in these kinds of campaigns looks like being able to kind of take breaks and allow allies or other ambassadors to bear some of that burden sometimes. I actually think Scouts for Equality, this organization from the 2010s, is a good model for this because many of the storytellers were queer themselves, and those were the folks kind of starting the petitions and out in the media. But almost the entire leadership team of that organization was straight, including Zach Walls, its founder. And it took some of the burden and the pressure off the more marginalized folks. And, sure, they still had to face the media, but I think the team was good about saying, like, you can take a step back if you need to. We have enough people here that someone else can talk to a reporter. And again, like, a lot of the just logistical burden was being borne by straight people, which I think was a really good model. So I think allies today can learn from that and understand that this is a role that they can and should play. Obviously, LGBTQ people should tell their own stories as much as they want to and speak for themselves, but allies can be that ambassador or even just support organizationally or do some of that behind the scenes work so that not all of the pressure is on the marginalized community.
If there are allies out there listening to our conversation and they want to get involved in this way, what's an easy way for them to do that?
Yeah, well, in the scouting context particular, like, I think you could very easily get involved in your troop leadership or council leadership. And, a lot of folks are starting DEI committees and, spearheading that on a local level, which is really cool. And I think that can happen beyond scouting too, whether it's in your school or your church group or whatever. If you are a straight person or just an ally to any kind of community, like, you can be the one that starts that conversation or that, does the organizational work of starting a committee or whatever. And then, of course, bring in the queer folks in your community to lead the discussions or to, really set the agenda. But, like, there's so many little pockets where this needs to happen, and so many individual groups and individual organizations. I think that's a really good place for allies to step in.
What would you say to an LGBTQ individual who is just really tired at this moment in time, but they feel like we're living in the tyranny of the moment, right? And what's the permission for them to step back?
I really do think we should give them permission to step back, give ourselves permission to step back, because no one wins if you are burnt out and if you are just completely exhausted. Like, we need to survive this moment, not just legislatively and all of that, but just like physically and mentally and spiritually. And there are a lot of us, like I said, we can take turns, we can take breaks. I don't think every single one of us needs to be going 100% all the time. Even when we look at the history that I talk about in my book, many of these things were episodic. Like, Scouts for Equality existed for a few years. Even someone like James Dale went about his life mostly and then just occasionally had to deal with some court stuff. Like, it doesn't have to be every single day for it to be impactful. So you really should have that permission to take a break.
Yeah. What's next for you? What are you working on that you can share with our listeners?
That is the $1 million question. Right now, I'm continuing mostly my freelance journalism work. So I write a lot about social justice and solutions beyond the book, just in kind of more political or context. So I write a lot about climate change too. So that's kind of my day-to-day right now. But I'm obviously starting to dream about what book 2 might look like. I really mean it when I say, like, I don't know what it's going to look like yet, but I loved writing this book. I want to write another one. And I also know it takes so much care and time and energy to do this well. So I'm on the hunt for what the next story might be, but I really want to make sure it's the right one before I pour myself into it.
Yeah. We didn't get a chance to talk about your climate change work.
Yeah.
I am just curious, are there any intersections with the work around LGBTQ inclusion and climate change? Are there intersecting points? What does that look like? How did the two combine, or are they two totally separate areas that you work in?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't often get to, like, talk about the intersections of them, but I think there's some obvious ones of just, thinking about organizing and activism. There are a lot of kind of shared strategies and lessons I think that can work in both spheres. Yeah, and I also think like there's something similar about taking the abstract and making it like really simple for people. Like in the LGBTQ space, it's like this abstract thing about policies and identities and all that. But then if you just bring it down to reality through a story or some other means, it's like, this is just a kid that wants to join Scouts and like feel welcome. Mm-hmm. And in climate change, again, it's like all these big scary things and policies and technologies. And then sometimes like in my writing, I just try to make it really simple of like, if you install a heat pump at your house, you'll have central air conditioning and it'll be cheaper and more comfortable. Like, sometimes it can just be really simple. So especially when I'm writing about solutions, I try to make it accessible for people in that way.
Yeah. But so many simple solutions together can make a lot of momentum, right?
Definitely. Yeah.
So lastly, the work we do here at the Facing Project is to create a more understanding and empathetic world. And we believe this is done through storytelling and active listening. I'd love for you to add your perspective on a question I'm asking all of my guests this season. How does one become a better and more authentic listener, particularly with individuals whose views differ from our own?
Such a good question. And this is always a skill that I'm trying to improve as a journalist. I think it's probably the most important skill I have in that work. One of my favorite techniques for active listening is really just to allow silence to do its job. When I'm interviewing someone or just talking to someone, I'm always really tempted to jump in, even just to affirm what they're saying or to make sure that they know I'm listening. And, those can be helpful things to do. But sometimes it's also really effective to just let the person talk and then not immediately fill the silence. Like some of the most insightful things that I have heard from people just come after I let a silence like marinate. And sometimes I'm not even doing it on purpose. I'm like typing and trying to catch up. And then there's like 10 seconds that go by and then they say something incredible. So I really love that technique, just letting silence do its job. I think when we're talking about people whose views differ from our own, we really need to resist the temptation to like win the conversation or to like immediately change minds. That almost never works, which I've had to learn the hard way. And I think it can be more effective and more interesting to just show genuine curiosity and to ask a lot of questions, not with the intention of like backing the other person into a corner, but to really actually learn about like how they arrived at their values and maybe finding that you have something in common.
Mm-hmm. Mike De Socio, author of Morally Straight, How the Fight for LGBTQ Inclusion Changed the Boy Scouts and America. Thank you for joining me on the Facing Project.
Thanks so much. This is a ton of fun.
Morally Straight is out now everywhere books are borrowed and sold. More about Mike De Socio and his work can be found at mikedesocio.com. Many thanks once again to Mike De Socio for joining me on today's show, and to his publisher Pegasus Books for providing a complimentary copy of Morally Straight, How the Fight for LGBTQ+ Inclusion Changes the Boy Scouts and America. To listen to past episodes of this program, visit indianapublicradio.org/The Facing Project, or find us on your favorite podcasting app, or just ask your smart speaker to play The Facing Project on NPR. To continue the conversation about this episode, find us on Facebook, Instagram, and X at The Facing Project. The Facing Project is recorded at Indiana Public Radio at Ball State University in beautiful and wonderful Muncie, Indiana. And it's produced by the amazing producer and audio engineer extraordinaire, Sean Ashcraft. The show is distributed nationally through PRX. I'm your host, J.R. Jamison. And until next time, I wish you the courage to share your own story and the empathy to listen to others.